The snow piled higher with each passing hour, but inside the Quonset hut, the warmth was undeniable. Neighbors laughed when he buried it beneath the cold earth, but now, as the bitter winter winds howled outside, they couldn't ignore the miracle he had built. Before we dive into the unbelievable story of survival, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The ground was frozen solid, and the wind blew so fiercely it felt as if the mountains themselves were howling in protest. Amidst the quiet, snowy wilderness of the northern plains, a man stood with a shovel in his hands, looking at the Quonset hut he had just buried beneath several feet of snow. Samuel stood there, his breath visible in the frigid air, his heavy coat buttoned up tight against the cold, and his thick, fur-lined boots sinking into the snow. His eyes were focused on the mound of snow that surrounded his creation, and though the harsh wind stung his cheeks, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was no ordinary shelter, and the neighbors who mocked him had no idea what they were about to witness. It hadn't been easy. The idea had come to him after months of surviving the bitter, unrelenting winters of the Rocky Mountains. He had watched too many cabins succumb to the elements, and more importantly to the weight of the snow and ice. Their walls cracked, their roofs collapsed, and worst of all, their warmth seemed to evaporate with the wind, leaving men and women freezing in their own homes. No one ever seemed to learn, and everyone just accepted that winter was something to endure, not conquer. But Samuel had had enough. He wasn't going to be another victim of the cold, another man who had to huddle by a fire and pray for the storm to pass. He knew there had to be a better way. So he started planning, mapping out the perfect way to build something that could stand the test of the harshest winter, something that would keep the warmth inside no matter how cruel the world outside became. The Quonset hut was the result of those months of thought, testing, and tinkering. He had buried it beneath the snow not because it was an afterthought, but because he understood the power of insulation, the power of the Earth's natural warmth. The ground, he knew, would stay much warmer than the freezing air, and by burying his hut beneath it, he could trap that heat and keep the interior warmer than the rest of the world could ever hope to be. But as the snow fell, and as the cold pressed against every structure around him, Samuel found himself surrounded by people who laughed at the absurdity of it all. "I'll give it a week before the whole thing caves in," one neighbor had joked when he first mentioned his idea. Another had chuckled and said, "You're wasting your time, Samuel. There's no way a man can make a hut that the weather can't break." They laughed sure. But Samuel knew he was right. It wasn't just about building a structure. It was about survival. And that, to him, was worth more than the laughter of those who couldn't see what he saw. His idea wasn't just a shelter, it was a solution to the very thing that had killed so many before him. He stepped back from the hut, surveying it with a critical eye. The storm was coming, but the hut was ready. It was as secure as it could be, and the warmth would stay inside. Samuel wasn't sure how the others would fare, but for him, the cold had already lost. The wind screamed outside like a wild animal searching for prey. Samuel sat in the dim light of the hut, listening to the sound of the storm rattling the metal sides, his gaze fixed on the small fire crackling in the stove. It wasn't a large fire, but it was enough to keep the air warm, enough to make the cold feel like it was something that belonged to another world entirely. The walls of the Quonset hut, coated in snow on the outside, held the warmth in, and for the first time in weeks, Samuel didn't feel the bitter sting of the cold creeping in. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, though he didn't need to. He'd learned that the warmth from the fire wasn't the only thing keeping the chill away. The insulation from the earth, the snow piled high around the structure, and the careful placement of the hut itself all contributed to the interior temperature, which remained a steady warmth, while outside, the air hovered around 25 degrees below zero. Inside, the temperature stayed a comfortable 38 degrees. It wasn't tropical, but it was the kind of warmth that allowed a man to survive in this unforgiving world. Still, the rest of the settlement didn't share his optimism. Samuel knew the townspeople were skeptical, and their derision had been obvious from the moment he had started digging. They had watched from their windows as he buried the hut in snow, their voices filled with mockery, their laughter ringing through the wind. Samuel could hear them even now, as if their disbelief had become a part of the storm itself. But he didn't let it get to him. The world had always been full of doubters, those who couldn't see beyond their own experiences, their own limitations. He wasn't bothered by it. He had learned long ago that when it came to survival, it was better to trust in yourself than to listen to the noise around you. The cold had taught him that lesson. It had broken so many before him, had taken the lives of those who hadn't been prepared, who hadn't thought beyond their own needs. The cold didn't care who you were or what you believed. It simply took and took until you were no more than a statistic, another name in a long list of casualties. But Samuel wasn't like them. He wasn't going to be taken by the cold. And he would prove it just as soon as the storm passed and the neighbors came to see the truth. The wind howled louder now, as if nature itself was trying to challenge his resolve, to make him doubt. But Samuel didn't falter. He walked to the door of the hut and peered outside. The snow was thick, the world outside, nothing but a blank, frozen canvas. And yet, inside his shelter, he could feel the heat gathering in his bones. For now, he was warm. For now, the storm could rage as much as it wanted. It wasn't going to change anything. He was ready, and he was going to survive. The cold would not win this time. The first snowfall had arrived without warning, blanketing the valley in a thick layer of white, turning the world into a winter wonderland, or what would have been if not for the biting cold. Samuel stood in the doorway of his Quonset hut, looking out over the snow-covered land. It wasn't yet the worst storm of the season, but the air had turned frigid, and the wind howled across the flatlands, pushing the snow into drifts that seemed to grow larger by the minute. Inside, however, the warmth was undeniable. Samuel had built a small fire in the stove, but even without it, the hut retained a certain cozy comfort. He had tested his theory the night before, staying up late to track the temperature outside and compare it to the inside warmth. The results were promising. The Quonset hut was holding steady at 35 degrees Fahrenheit, even with the temperature outside dipping into the teens. Still, doubt lingered in his mind. The Quonset hut's success was based on principles he had tested on paper, but this was no mere experiment. This was survival. He wasn't about to put his faith in something that hadn't been truly tested by the full force of a Rocky Mountain winter. The real storm was yet to come, and Samuel knew that the next few weeks would be the true test of his creation. He wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck and pulled on his fur-lined gloves before stepping outside to survey the land. The wind hit him immediately, biting at his exposed face with an icy sting. He had grown used to it, but it never failed to remind him of the harshness of his environment. Every movement felt like a battle against the elements, and even now, with his innovative shelter, Samuel knew that he wasn't entirely safe. As he walked around the Quonset hut, his boots crunching through the snow, he couldn't help but notice the first signs of weakness in the snowbank surrounding the structure. A few small cracks appeared where the snow had settled unevenly. It wasn't much, but it made Samuel uneasy. The snow was his insulation. But if it began to shift or compact too much, it could expose the hut to the full force of the wind. He had expected the snow to behave this way, but now, standing in the cold, it felt like a ticking clock. He shook his head. Doubt wasn't something he could afford. He had built this hut with precision and care, with a design that had the potential to stand up to anything the weather could throw at it. Still, the thought gnawed at him. What if the snow shifted in a way he hadn't accounted for? What if this was all for nothing? But as the snow continued to fall, Samuel straightened up and returned to the warmth of his hut. His doubts remained, but they were the doubts of a man who had already given so much to this project. His hands were stiff from the cold, but he refused to let the uncertainty take root. He had one goal: survival. and if this hut could withstand the worst of the season, it would prove everything he had hoped for. By the time the first major storm of the season rolled in, Samuel was ready. The wind had grown more furious overnight, and now as the storm began in earnest, the temperature dropped even further. The world outside his hut was now nothing more than a blizzard, the snowflakes sharp and biting as they hurtled through the air. Inside, however, Samuel felt the comforting warmth of his shelter, a warmth that was holding steady despite the rage of the storm outside. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to believe that his experiment had worked. The Quonset hut was a success. He had known, deep down, that it could withstand the weather, but it was a different thing to experience it firsthand. As he stood by the stove, the fire crackling, he felt a quiet pride swell within him. But even as the warmth settled around him, Samuel couldn't shake the thought that the worst of the storm was still to come. A few hours into the blizzard, a knock came at the door. Samuel's first instinct was to ignore it. The neighbors had made it clear how they felt about his unconventional shelter, and he wasn't in the mood to listen to their mocking anymore. But the knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. With a sigh, Samuel opened the door to find Tom Cartwright, one of his more vocal critics, standing outside, his face red from the cold and his coat covered in snow. The man was a trapper, like Samuel, but his cabin was a traditional log structure, built the way it always had been. "Couldn't help but notice," Tom said, shivering as he stepped into the warmth of the hut. "This thing is holding up pretty well." Samuel didn't respond at first. He closed the door and motioned for Tom to sit near the stove. "What brings you out here in this weather?" he asked, his voice measured, but not unkind. Tom hesitated before answering. "My cabin's leaking. The roof's starting to cave in from the snow. I figured I'd stop by and see if you were still around. It looks like you've got something worth checking out." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You want me to help you fix your cabin?" Tom nodded, embarrassed but not willing to admit defeat. "Could use some advice, and maybe a hand. I've got firewood, but that's about it." For the first time, Samuel saw the man for what he truly was, someone who had been doing things the same way for years, but now found himself in need of help. It wasn't something Samuel had anticipated, but it made sense. The weather had a way of making a man rethink his stubbornness. "You're welcome to stay," Samuel said, his tone softer than before. "We'll figure it out." As the storm raged outside, Samuel's mind shifted. This wasn't just about proving his idea right anymore. It was about showing the community that survival could come through adaptation, through new ways of thinking. And perhaps, just perhaps, his method could make a difference in a world that was slowly being buried beneath the weight of the snow. The warmth inside the hut felt even more significant now. It wasn't just shelter. It was the start of something larger, something that might just change everything for those willing to embrace it. The storm raged on for days, its fury unrelenting, as if the sky itself was determined to punish anyone foolish enough to challenge the cold. The wind howled through the barren landscape, driving the snow in all directions, creating drifts that buried the small town and its inhabitants. Yet, within Samuel's Quonset hut, the warmth remained constant. The fire crackled softly in the stove, and the interior was cozy, a sharp contrast to the blizzard outside. Samuel spent the next few days in solitude, focusing on maintaining the warmth and keeping the fire stoked. He had taken careful notes of the temperature inside, and despite the relentless storm, it remained steady at a comfortable 38 degrees Fahrenheit, well above freezing and far warmer than the outside temperature, which had plunged below 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Each morning, Samuel ventured outside to check on the snowdrifts, ensuring that the snow around the hut was still packed tightly, providing insulation. The Quonset hut's metal shell was buried under layers of snow, and the structure was holding strong. Inside, the warmth seemed to radiate from the walls themselves, keeping the cold from seeping in. The earth beneath the hut's floor, insulated by the snow, also contributed to the consistent temperature inside, helping to keep the chill at bay. As the storm continued, Samuel grew more confident in his creation. The neighbors had all retreated into their own homes, huddling around stoves and fires, their faces pinched from the cold, their homes shaking with every gust of wind. Samuel, however, felt a growing sense of pride as he sat inside his hut, warm and secure. He had set out to build something that could withstand the worst the weather could offer. And so far, it was working. One evening, as the wind whipped outside and the snow continued to fall, Samuel noticed a figure in the distance. Through the small window, he could just make out the shape of a man trudging through the snow, his form hunched against the cold. As the figure drew closer, Samuel recognized him. It was Tom Cartwright. Without hesitation, Samuel opened the door and waved him inside. "Come on in," he said. "The storm's not letting up, and it looks like you could use some warmth." Tom stepped inside, shaking the snow off his coat. His face was ruddy from the cold, and his breath puffed out in visible clouds. "I didn't think I'd make it to your door," he said, his voice rough from the wind. "I figured this storm might beat me, but I had to see it for myself." Samuel nodded, closing the door behind him. "What brings you back?" Tom hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking. You were right about this hut. The warmth inside, it's different from anything I've felt in my cabin. I was hoping you could show me how to build one of these." The request was surprising, but Samuel didn't hesitate. He had spent years trying to make his vision a reality. If the storm and the warmth inside had convinced Tom of the value of his idea, then maybe it was time to share what he had learned. "I'll show you," Samuel said, his voice steady. "But it won't be easy. This method takes time and patience. We'll need to dig in, get the foundation right, and make sure the insulation is perfect." Tom nodded, his eyes reflecting a new sense of resolve. "I'm willing to learn," he said. As the storm raged on outside, Samuel and Tom sat down by the fire, the warmth of the hut wrapping around them. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a chance to teach, to pass on the knowledge Samuel had gained through trial and error. For the first time, he felt like his invention wasn't just a personal victory. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change the way people survived in this unforgiving world. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Days blurred together in the constant howl of wind and the thick curtain of snow that blocked the sun. For the first time, Samuel felt a shift in the air, something intangible but undeniable. The other settlers, once so eager to mock his unconventional shelter, had begun to change their tune. It wasn't immediate, but Samuel could sense the change, a curiosity creeping into the glances they cast at his hut, a hesitation in their words when they spoke about it. It was Tom who first broached the subject. The two men had spent the past few days working together, building another Quonset hut for Tom's family. As they worked, they discussed the technique in more detail, refining their methods and adjusting the designs to make them even more efficient. They had made real progress, and with each passing day, Samuel found himself gaining a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't expected. One afternoon, as they took a break from the work and sat by the fire, Tom spoke up. "You know," he began, "I've been talking to some of the others. A few of them are starting to wonder if your method really works. They're asking questions now. They want to know how you built it, what makes it different from their cabins." Samuel didn't respond right away. He took a long sip from his mug and stared into the fire, letting Tom's words sink in. "Curiosity's a powerful thing," Samuel finally said. "People don't change easily, especially out here. They think the old ways are the only ways. But when the cold gets bad enough, they'll start looking for new answers." Tom nodded. "I don't know if they'll admit it, but they're starting to see what you've done. They've felt the warmth inside here. They've seen your hut holding up against the storm while their homes are shaking apart. They want to know how it works, Samuel." Samuel's thoughts wandered as he stared into the flames. He had never built this hut for recognition or praise. He hadn't done it to be proven right or to gain the admiration of others. He had built it because he had to, because the cold was too great a force to ignore, and because he believed there was a better way to survive. But now, as Tom spoke, Samuel felt a spark of hope ignite inside him. Maybe, just maybe, his work could help others too. Over the next few days, word spread throughout the settlement. People began stopping by, their faces cautious but filled with interest. They wanted to see the hut for themselves, to experience its warmth firsthand. Some were skeptical, still clinging to their old beliefs that a Quonset hut could never replace the tried-and-true log cabins. But more and more, they found themselves drawn to the idea, intrigued by the possibility of building something more resilient, something that could withstand the brutal conditions of the mountains. Samuel didn't mind the skepticism anymore. He had learned long ago that people didn't change overnight. It was enough that they were curious, that they were willing to ask questions and consider alternatives. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the storm began to break, the sunlight shining through the snowflakes, Samuel looked out across the valley, knowing that the real test was still ahead. But for now, he allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment. The mockery had faded, replaced by curiosity. And that, he knew, was just the beginning. The storm had finally eased, though the world remained blanketed in deep snow and biting cold. Samuel stood outside his Quonset hut, surveying the landscape. The sun shone weakly through the clouds, but the temperature remained far below freezing. Even with the calm after the storm, the world outside felt as though it were holding its breath. Samuel had done what he set out to do. His hut had endured the worst of the storm, and the warmth inside had held steady. Yet something inside him felt restless. He knew that the success of his shelter was only part of the story. There was still more to be done. As he stood there, Tom came up behind him, his boots crunching through the snow. Samuel turned to greet him. "Morning," Samuel said, his voice steady, but with a hint of weariness. Tom had been helping him build another hut for his family, and they'd been working tirelessly over the past few days. The storm had taken its toll on both of them. "Morning," Tom replied, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. "It's hard to believe that just a few days ago, this place was a blizzard. Feels like it's been weeks since the sky cleared." Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. The world felt strangely quiet now, almost as if it was in recovery from the fury of the storm. "It's something, isn't it?" Samuel said. "This hut. It's more than just a shelter. It's a way of thinking. People don't understand how it works until they see it for themselves." Tom glanced over at him, his brow furrowed. "I've been wondering about that," he said slowly. "How does it stay so warm? You've never really explained how it works. We've been talking about it all week, but you've kept the details close to the chest." Samuel didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted back to the hut. He had been cautious about sharing the full extent of his method, worried that others might try to replicate it without understanding the underlying principles. But now, standing here with Tom, the time felt right. He couldn't keep the knowledge to himself any longer. The storm had proved the shelter's worth, and it was time to share what he had learned. "The secret," Samuel began, his voice low, "lies in the way the earth helps to regulate the temperature inside. The snow, the ground, the insulation, it all works together." Tom tilted his head, clearly intrigued. "What do you mean?" Samuel paused, considering how to explain it in the simplest terms. "The earth beneath us holds warmth," he said. "It absorbs heat during the day, even in winter, and holds onto it. That heat radiates up through the ground, and by burying the hut, I've created a constant source of warmth. The snow insulates the entire structure, keeping the cold out, while the ground underneath keeps the temperature inside steady. It's a natural system, one that doesn't rely on heavy fuel or constant attention." Tom's eyes widened with understanding. "So it's not just the shelter itself that keeps the warmth in, it's the ground too?" "That's right," Samuel replied. "The ground's heat does most of the work. The Quonset shape helps too. It's designed to shed wind and distribute pressure evenly, and the snow around it acts as an additional insulator. But without the earth, the hut wouldn't stay as warm as it does." Tom nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "I see now. This isn't just about the structure. It's about understanding how everything works together. You've harnessed nature itself." Samuel smiled, a quiet pride in his words. "That's exactly it. It's not about fighting the cold, it's about using what nature provides." The two men stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the significance of what Samuel had shared. There was something profound about the way the hut worked. It wasn't just an innovation in design, but a deeper understanding of the environment around them. For Samuel, it was more than just survival. It was about learning from the land and building something that would last long after they were gone. Tom broke the silence with a laugh. "I'll be damned. No wonder the others are starting to take an interest. They'll be asking for your secret soon enough." Samuel chuckled, the sound warm in the quiet of the morning. "Let them ask. I'm happy to share it. This isn't something to keep hidden. It's something that can help all of us survive." As they made their way back inside, Tom clapped Samuel on the back. "I'm glad I came by, Samuel. You've got something here that could change everything." Samuel watched him go, feeling a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't expected. The hut had proven itself, but now, with the knowledge he'd shared, it had the potential to change lives. The days following the storm brought an uneasy calm. The world outside had settled into a frozen stillness, the wind no longer howling, and the snow now a constant blanket over the land. Samuel's Quonset hut stood firm against the elements, but he knew that the real test was still ahead. The worst of winter had yet to come. Over the next few weeks, Samuel and Tom worked side by side to finish the second hut. Tom had become an eager student, asking questions, taking notes, and absorbing everything Samuel had to offer. Samuel had grown accustomed to the constant barrage of inquiries, and he answered them patiently, always careful to explain the principles behind the structure, never letting the details slip away. He had learned long ago that knowledge was best shared, but also best earned. As they worked, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. Word of his hut's success had begun to spread through the settlement. Neighbors who had once laughed now watched with quiet interest, their skepticism slowly melting away like the snow in the afternoon sun. But while the attention was flattering, Samuel didn't want praise. He wanted action. He knew that survival in the mountains didn't come from words alone. It came from proving something could withstand the test of time, the test of nature. The temperatures continued to dip, and Samuel kept a close eye on the weather forecasts. The next storm was coming, a brutal one, predicted to be the harshest of the season. He had no illusions that his hut would be completely unaffected, but he was confident it would perform better than the other cabins in the area. The snow would pile high, the wind would howl, but the Quonset hut would endure. Still, Samuel prepared for the worst. He gathered supplies, made sure the firewood was stocked, and reinforced the door and window shutters. He spent an entire afternoon checking the structural integrity of the hut, ensuring that every log was secure, every joint was tight, and that the snow around the hut was packed evenly, providing maximum insulation. Tom had been helping him with the preparations, and as they stood outside the hut that evening, watching the last rays of sunlight fade over the horizon, Samuel turned to him. "This next storm will be the real test. It's one thing to survive a few days of snow, but this could be different. We'll need to make sure everything is ready." Tom nodded, his face serious. "I trust your design. We've seen it work, even in the worst of it." Samuel's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Trust won't be enough. We have to be prepared for anything. As the wind picked up and the first flakes of snow began to fall again, Samuel knew that the storm was more than just a test of his hut. It was a test of everything he had worked for. and a test of the strength of the belief that had driven him to build something that no one else could understand. "Let's get inside," Samuel said. "It's going to be a long night." And as the door closed behind them, they stepped into the warmth of the hut, knowing that the real test was just beginning. The storm hit with the kind of force that Samuel had only heard about in old tales, the kind of storm that turned the land into a frozen wasteland, swallowing everything in its path. The wind picked up violently, lashing the hut's exterior with flurries of snow, battering the metal frame with such intensity that Samuel feared for a moment it might give way. But inside the Quonset hut, the warmth remained steady. The fire crackled in the stove, and the temperature inside was still a comfortable 35 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the frigid air that now dropped to a deadly negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Samuel stood by the window, watching the storm unfold, the snow swirling in blinding gusts. From the safety of his shelter, the storm looked almost beautiful, a chaotic, wild display of nature's power. But he knew better. The storm was merciless, and those unprepared would suffer greatly. Tom, now staying with Samuel for the duration of the storm, stood by the stove, tending to the fire. The two of them had spent the morning securing the hut, checking every nook and cranny, making sure the door and windows were properly sealed. Samuel had learned early on that the key to surviving the winter wasn't just about having a shelter. It was about maintaining it, monitoring it, and constantly adapting to the weather's unpredictable nature. "You think it's going to hold?" Tom asked, his voice laced with uncertainty as he threw another log onto the fire. Samuel didn't look away from the window. "It's going to hold," he said, his voice steady. "This storm isn't the first one we've faced, and it won't be the last. We've made the right preparations." Despite his words, Samuel couldn't help but feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him. He had designed this shelter to withstand exactly this kind of weather, but no one could predict how nature would react. As the storm raged on, Samuel listened intently to the howling winds, wondering if this time the shelter would face more than it could handle. The storm grew more intense as the night wore on. The wind rattled the metal shell of the hut, the sound reminiscent of a distant, angry animal. The snow outside became so thick that Samuel could no longer see beyond the edge of the hut. He tried to focus on the warmth within, on the safety of the shelter, but his thoughts drifted back to the others, the neighbors who had once laughed at his design, the ones now trapped in their own homes, their walls creaking and groaning under the pressure of the storm. Around midnight, the wind hit its peak. The roar outside became deafening, and the temperature inside the hut dropped several degrees. Samuel and Tom exchanged concerned looks, but neither spoke. There was nothing to do but wait and hope that the hut would continue to hold strong. As the storm raged through the night, Samuel could feel his resolve strengthen. This was the test. If the hut survived this, there would be no more doubt. The others would have to see what he had built, what they had dismissed. Samuel had built it not just to survive, but to thrive, even in the worst conditions. By dawn, the storm had begun to ease. The wind still howled in the distance, but the worst had passed. Samuel opened the door and stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He looked around, taking in the world, transformed by the storm. The snow was deep, the drifts towering over the landscape. Yet when Samuel looked back at the Quonset hut, he saw that it had withstood the fury of the storm, standing firm, its metal shell still intact. "We made it through," Samuel said quietly as Tom stepped up beside him. "This hut's ready for anything." Tom looked at the structure in awe. "You were right. It's not just the shelter. It's the way you've thought about it. You've made something that can withstand the worst." Samuel nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The storm had tested everything, the shelter, his methods, and his resolve, and he had passed. The cold, fierce winds could howl as much as they wanted. Samuel knew that he was ready for whatever came next. In the days that followed the storm, The world outside slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The snow still lay thick on the ground, but the winds had died down, and the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a pale light over the snow-covered landscape. Samuel, Tom, and the others spent the next few days clearing the drifts around the huts, making sure that the paths to the shelters were passable. Samuel's Quonset hut remained, untouched by the storm, standing as sturdy and warm as ever. By now, the neighbors had begun to notice. At first, they'd remained quiet, hesitant to acknowledge the success of Samuel's design. They had seen the storm rage outside, heard the wind howling, and had no doubt that their own cabins had suffered from the storm's wrath. But Samuel's hut had endured. The warmth inside had remained constant, and while the other cabins had begun to show signs of damage, his shelter had weathered the storm without issue. One afternoon, just after the storm had passed, Samuel was out front, clearing the snow from the path to the hut, when he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. He turned to see his neighbor, Elias, approaching. Elias was one of the more skeptical settlers, a man who had never fully believed in the Quonset hut's potential. But today, he wasn't laughing. "Samuel," Elias said, nodding as he approached, I wanted to talk to you." Samuel raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. He knew this moment was coming, and he had been preparing for it. Elias wasn't one to admit he was wrong, but there was something in his tone now that told Samuel this conversation was going to be different. "I've been hearing things," Elias continued, looking down at the ground as if unsure how to proceed, "about your hut. People are talking. They're saying it held up better than any of the cabins around here." Samuel nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "That's right. It did hold up. The storm didn't get through." Elias looked up, his face softening. "I didn't think it would work. I'll admit that. I figured the snow and the wind would tear it apart, but I was wrong. Your shelter's still standing." Samuel shrugged as though the outcome were no surprise. "It was designed to withstand storms like this." "That's the point." Elias shifted his weight, his eyes flicking to the hut. "Well, it worked. And the others are starting to see it too. They're asking questions now. They want to know how you did it." Samuel glanced back at the Quonset hut, the metal frame gleaming in the weak sunlight. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that change could come to the mountains, that innovation could make a difference. "Let them ask," Samuel said, turning back to Elias. "I'll show them how it works. If they want to learn, I'll teach them." Elias looked at him with a new respect, his earlier skepticism replaced by curiosity. "Maybe you've got something here, Samuel, something that can help all of us." Samuel smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Maybe I do." The storm had passed, but the winds of change were only just beginning to stir. Samuel knew that the real work was only starting. But for now, the warmth inside his hut and the respect of his neighbors was all the proof he needed. The days that followed the storm were quiet but charged with an energy Samuel hadn't expected. Word had spread like wildfire through the settlement, carried by the few brave souls who had ventured out into the blizzard and made it back to their cabins. Samuel's Quonset hut, the strange, buried structure that had once been a subject of mockery, had withstood the worst of the winter storm, while their own cabins, the ones built with tried and true methods, had cracked, leaked, and in some cases started to collapse under the weight of the snow. For the first time, Samuel noticed the subtle shift in the air as he moved through the settlement. Neighbors no longer avoided him, nor did they laugh behind his back. Instead, they nodded, greeted him with more warmth than he was used to, and asked casual questions about the hut. It wasn't much yet, but the curiosity had begun to grow. One morning, while Samuel was chopping wood in front of his hut, he noticed a familiar face approach. It was Elias, the man who had been one of the loudest skeptics of his project. Elias was holding a shovel and had a determined look on his face, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. "Samuel," Elias called out, walking up to the front of the Quonset hut, "I've been thinking." Samuel paused his work and wiped his brow. He wasn't sure what to expect. The last conversation with Elias had been tentative, but it had carried the seed of curiosity. "Thinking about what?" he asked, his tone neutral, but patient. Elias didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced back toward his own cabin, where the snow had drifted high against the wooden walls, and the structure creaked with every gust of wind. "About your hut," Elias finally said. "I've been seeing the way it holds up. My cabin's been giving me trouble ever since that storm. The roof's leaking, and the wind's getting in through the cracks in the logs." Samuel nodded. "It's been tough on all of us. This weather doesn't let up easily." "I know," Elias said, his voice softening a little. "But I'm wondering if maybe there's something to this idea of yours. You said you'd show me how it works. I'm ready to learn. I want to understand how your design keeps the cold out. I need a solution." Samuel studied Elias for a moment. The man looked tired, his coat patched and worn from the seasons of hard use. His pride, once a barrier, was gone now, replaced by something different, a willingness to learn, to adapt. It was all Samuel had wanted. It wasn't just about the hut, it was about changing the way people thought about surviving in the wilderness. "All right," Samuel said, his voice steady, but full of the quiet satisfaction of seeing change happen. "Come with me. I'll show you what I've learned." They spent the next few hours discussing the design of the Quonset hut, the way it used the earth beneath to regulate the temperature, how the shape of the structure shed the wind and kept the heat inside. Samuel demonstrated the importance of insulating materials and the advantages of burying the hut to trap the heat from the ground. As they worked, a few more settlers stopped by, watching from a distance, their faces full of skepticism, but also curiosity. Samuel didn't mind. He wasn't in a rush. One person's belief in the idea was a start, and Elias's willingness to learn was enough for now. By the end of the day, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. Elias looked at the Quonset hut with newfound respect. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "It's not just the structure, it's how you've used the land itself, how you've thought about the weather and the elements. This isn't about brute strength, it's about working with what's already here." Samuel nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Exactly. It's about adaptation, it's about survival." Elias stood there for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful. "I'll start working on something like this. It's going to take time, but I think it's the way forward." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "It'll take time, but you'll get there. Just remember, it's not the quickest way to build, but it's the best." As Elias turned to leave, Samuel felt a sense of pride swelling inside him. The seed had been planted. The idea had taken root in Elias's mind, and he wasn't alone in his curiosity anymore. Slowly the winds of change were shifting, and Samuel's method, his new way of thinking, was beginning to take hold in a place where tradition had ruled for so long. The following week was filled with steady work and small, incremental changes. Samuel had spent his time refining the method he had developed, ensuring that the next cabin built would be just as strong as the first. He worked with Elias and a few others, showing them the finer details of his construction process and explaining how each piece of the design worked in harmony with the others. Word continued to spread through the settlement, and more settlers stopped by, each asking questions, some more eager than others to learn the techniques Samuel had perfected. One morning, after a particularly grueling day of manual labor, Samuel received an unexpected visitor. It was Tom Cartwright, the trapper who had helped him with his own cabin at the beginning of the winter. Tom had stopped by several times in the past week, more curious each time, asking questions, taking notes. But this visit was different. Tom arrived with a serious look on his face, his coat pulled tight around him, and a heavy pack on his back. "Samuel," Tom greeted him, his voice tinged with urgency, "I've got a proposition for you." Samuel paused his work and wiped his brow. "What's going on, Tom?" Tom glanced around quickly, as if making sure no one else was listening. "I've been talking to some of the others," he said quietly. "They're starting to take this seriously now. They want to see the hut in action, to see if it can really handle a full winter, not just one storm. Some of them think it's just luck, but others are curious. They're ready to build, Samuel, and they want you to show them how. Samuel paused for a moment, feeling the weight of Tom's words. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for, the moment when the people who had once doubted him would finally see the truth of his design. But with the offer came responsibility. If they were going to trust him, they would need to understand the full extent of the work involved. "I can't just show them the basics, Tom," Samuel said slowly. "It's more than that. It's about understanding the process, not just the result. It's about the land, the snow, and the weather. This isn't a quick fix. It's a way of life." Tom nodded, his expression serious. "I know, but they're ready to listen. They're ready to learn," Samuel thought for a moment. The decision was bigger than just building more huts. It was about teaching others to adapt, to change the way they thought about survival in the mountains. It was about ensuring that the future of the settlement was secure. "All right," Samuel said finally. "I'll show them, but they'll have to be ready for the work. It's not easy, and it's not quick. But if they want it, they'll have to earn it." Tom's face broke into a grin. "They're ready, Samuel. They're ready to learn." As Tom left to gather the others, Samuel stood outside and looked at the Quonset hut. The storm had passed, and the world outside was still, the air cold, but clear. He knew what was coming. The settlement was about to change, and his hut, his design, was going to be at the center of it all. The big reveal was just beginning. The following days were filled with hard labor, camaraderie, and a sense of shared purpose that Samuel hadn't expected. The group of settlers that had expressed interest in Samuel's design had gathered in front of his Quonset hut, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. They were ready to learn, but Samuel knew that the process wouldn't be easy. There was more to his shelter than just a few clever tricks. This was about understanding how to adapt to the land, how to use the environment to your advantage. Survival, Samuel had learned, wasn't just about endurance. It was about innovation. Elias was the first to arrive each day, eager to get started. His cabin had already shown signs of the storm's impact, and the repairs he'd attempted only seemed to make things worse. He wasn't alone in his frustrations either. Samuel could see it in the other men's eyes. The yearning to do better, to find a way to survive that didn't involve constant patchwork. The first thing Samuel did was explain the fundamentals of the Quonset hut. "It's not just about the shape or the materials," he said one morning, gathering the group around. "It's about understanding how it interacts with the earth. You can't just build and hope for the best. You have to think about the ground beneath you, the way the snow and the wind affect your structure. That's the secret." The settlers nodded, their attention peaked. They had been building cabins in the same way for years, cutting down trees, notching logs, and hoping that the wood would hold up. But none of them had considered how the earth itself could play a role in keeping them warm. "We'll start with the foundation," Samuel continued. "That's where everything begins. Without a solid foundation, nothing else matters. You have to dig a trench around your cabin, fill it with rocks, and build your walls on top of that. The earth will keep the cold from seeping in from below." The work was grueling. The men spent hours digging the trench, gathering stones from the surrounding area, and preparing the site. It was a new way of thinking for them, but slowly they began to see the sense in it. The deeper they dug, the warmer the ground felt. By the time they'd finished the foundation, the temperature inside the trench was noticeably higher than it had been outside. Once the foundation was in place, the group began to build the walls, selecting the logs carefully and ensuring they fit snugly together. Samuel's meticulous approach to log selection, his refusal to use any logs that were crooked or irregular, had them working slower than they were used to. But each log was a piece of the larger puzzle, a puzzle that Samuel knew had to be perfect if they were to survive the coming winter. The day was long, the work demanding, but at the end of each day, Samuel could see the change in the men. There was no longer any mocking laughter, no more doubt in their eyes. The work was hard, but it was rewarding. They were building something that would last, something that would give them the security they had been missing. By the end of the week, the foundation and walls were nearly finished. The Quonset hut's shape was beginning to take form, and for the first time, the settlers could see the benefits of Samuel's design. It wasn't just the warmth that had them excited. It was the sense of purpose, the idea that they were finally building something that could stand the test of time. "Looks like we're on the right track," Elias said one evening, wiping the sweat from his brow. His face was tired but content. "I can already feel the difference in the air." Samuel looked at the half-finished structure with quiet satisfaction. "We've got a long way to go, but this is just the beginning. If we keep working, we'll have something better than we've ever had before." The future was taking shape before their eyes, and Samuel knew that this wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. It was about changing the way they thought about life in the mountains, about building a future where adaptation and ingenuity were just as important as strength and endurance. As the days passed, the settlers worked tirelessly alongside Samuel, their efforts slowly transforming the pile of logs and stones into a shelter that was more than just a cabin. It was the beginning of something new. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always quick, but with each passing day, Samuel could see the men becoming more invested in the process. The quiet pride they began to feel as the structure took shape was evident in their movements, in the way they approached their work. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about creating something better for the future. The Quonset hut structure was unmistakable now. The logs, carefully chosen and fitted together, stood tall and firm, and the metal shell that had been buried beneath the snow now gleamed in the weak winter sunlight. Samuel had shown them how to seal the walls, how to chink between the logs with a mixture of clay and pine resin, and how to construct a roof that would hold up against the weight of snow and rain. Each step had taken time, but Samuel had insisted that the details were crucial. They couldn't afford to rush. The first night they spent inside the nearly finished hut was a revelation. The temperature outside had dropped again, the wind cutting through the valley with icy precision. But inside, the warmth was constant. The fire crackled in the stove, and the air felt thick with comfort. The men gathered around the stove, their faces glowing with the warmth of the fire, but also with the satisfaction of knowing that they had helped build something that could stand against the harsh elements. "I'll be damned," Tom said, breaking the silence. "It's warmer in here than I thought it'd be. I've spent winters in cabins that never felt this good, even with a fire roaring." Samuel smiled. It wasn't the kind of pride that came with showing off something flashy or new. This was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his work had made a real difference, not just for him, but for everyone who would rely on it in the coming months. Over the next few days, more settlers came by, drawn by the stories that had begun to circulate about Samuel's hut. They wanted to see for themselves, to feel the warmth, to witness the success of something they had once dismissed as a pipe dream. Some of them still questioned the practicality of the design, but as they stepped inside the hut, their doubts slowly began to melt away. The warmth wasn't just a result of the fire. It was the earth, the snow, and the meticulous construction that made it work. By the time the roof was finished, the Quonset hut stood as a testament to Samuel's vision. It was a shelter, yes, but it was also a symbol of something bigger, a shift in thinking, a movement away from tradition and towards adaptation. The settlers had learned that survival wasn't just about brute strength. It was about learning to live with the land, not against it. As Samuel stood outside the finished hut, watching the sun set behind the mountains, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The hut had withstood the test of nature, and in doing so, it had proven something far greater than just its physical resilience. It had shown the settlers that change was possible, that innovation, no matter how small or unconventional, could lead to a better, safer future. The silent success of the Quonset hut wasn't something that could be measured in numbers or accolades. It was in the quiet pride of the men who had helped build it, in the warmth that filled the space when the world outside was frozen and unyielding. It was in the realization that they had created something that could withstand anything the wilderness threw at them, and that, Samuel knew, was more than enough. As the weeks passed, more settlers began building their own Quonset huts. Samuel's design spread throughout the valley, changing the way people approached survival. Neighbors who once doubted him now sought his advice, eager to adopt his methods. The landscape was gradually transforming, one hut at a time. Samuel watched as the settlement shifted from traditional log cabins to more resilient, adaptive structures. It wasn't just about the huts anymore, it was about a new way of thinking, a shift in mindset that prioritized practicality, sustainability, and survival. Change had taken root. By midwinter, the word had spread far beyond the valley. Settlers from neighboring regions came to witness Samuel's work firsthand. Some came to learn, others came to see if the stories were true. One afternoon, a group of them arrived, offering thanks for Samuel's innovation. As they stepped inside the hut, the warmth greeted them like a long-lost friend. "This is what we need," one of them said, eyes wide with amazement. Samuel nodded quietly, not needing to boast. His work spoke for itself. His once lonely vision had blossomed into something that could benefit everyone. The snow began to melt in the early spring, revealing the true extent of Samuel's success. The Quonset huts stood strong against the elements, their warmth constant through the harshest winter the valley had seen in years. As the settlers gathered together for a community meeting, it was clear that Samuel had changed the way they thought about survival. No longer were they shackled to outdated methods. Samuel's vision had given them a new, lasting sense of security and, in the process, a renewed sense of unity. This was the real victory, a community stronger, wiser, and warmer. Samuel stood in front of his completed hut, the landscape now a patchwork of his creations. The winter had come and gone, leaving behind a group of settlers more resilient than before. Samuel had not sought recognition. His work had been about survival, about a solution that worked. As he moved to leave for the Oregon Territory, the settlers gathered to thank him, to shake his hand, but Samuel only nodded. His legacy wouldn't be written in books or plaques, but in the sturdy huts that would outlast generations, standing as silent monuments to a man who understood that survival could be more than just brute force.